Hello, bonjour. Welcome to the 10th Annual Climate Change Week. My name is Lauren Clark and I'm the project coordinator with EOS Eco Energy. So EOS is an environmental charity and we've been around for more than 17 years and we work on lots of different projects to do with sustainable community planning, energy conservation, renewable energy, climate change adaptation. We do water quality monitoring, habitat assessments, lots of fun stuff like that. We would like to respectfully acknowledge that our work is done on the traditional unceded lands and waters of the Mi'kmaq. So I want to introduce our guest, Dr. Susan O'Donnell, who's a researcher an EdGec professor in the Environment and Society program at St. Thomas University. And also the sociology department at the University of New Brunswick in Fredericton. So Susan leads the RAVEN project, which is Rural Action and Voices for the Environment at UNB. And she uses media to highlight rural and environmental issues in New Brunswick. RAVEN has been researching and writing about the proposal to build more nuclear reactors, SMRs, in New Brunswick at Point Lepreau on the Bay of Fundy. So welcome, Susan.
Thank you, Lauren. And I just wanted to say thank you to the organizers of the Tantramar Climate Change Week. Really appreciate it. I'm just going to share my screen. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, there we go. Right, so my talk tonight is called More Nuclear Reactors for New Brunswick. I'm a social scientist. One of my specialty areas is technology adoption studies, and I was a senior researcher at the National Research Council here in Fredericton for more than 13 years. And tonight I'm going to use my critical social science lens to analyze more nuclear reactors in New Brunswick. Okay. So when I first heard about these new reactors that were proposed for the province, I went right away to the New Brunswick Power website and the Government of New Brunswick website. And I saw right away that there was a lot of critical information missing, such as the risks that we were going to be exposed to. And so our project RAVEN investigated. And over the last 2 years, we've published more than 30 articles and commentaries in a range of publications. And then we joined the Coalition for Responsible Energy Development in New Brunswick, CRED-NB, to share information and support activism against the proposed reactors. So tonight, Tonight, I'm going to talk about a range of topics that I've listed there, and I hope there's something that interests you. There's going to be time for a Q&A afterwards. I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes. So I'm really looking forward to your questions and comments. Okay. Right. So to start, just so everyone's on the same page, we do already have an existing nuclear reactor. There's a fuzzy picture of it there. It was opened in 1983. It's the NB Power Point Lepreau nuclear generating station. It's on the Bay of Fundy. It's the only nuclear plant in the Atlantic provinces. New Brunswick is the only province outside of Ontario that has operational nuclear power reactors. And then about 30 years later, just less than 30 years, the decision was made to rebuild the reactor, called a refurbishment, and then it was opened again in 2012. The original build and the rebuild are responsible for 3.6 billion of NB Power's 4.9 billion debt. Lepreau supplies about 30% of the electricity in New Brunswick, but it's unreliable. And what I mean by that is it breaks down a lot. 2 years ago, the NB Power Chief Financial Officer said that Lepreau's record of breaking down more than expected was the single biggest weight dragging down NB Power's financial results. And Lepreau is scheduled to be shut down around 2040, and it recently applied for a 25-year operating license renewal. You might have heard about that. I'm not going to talk about that this evening, but I'd be happy to answer questions later if you're interested. Okay, So now NB Power is proposing new reactors for New Brunswick. It wants to replace Lepreau with multiple SMRs. They're called small modular nuclear reactors, SMNRs. They took out the nuclear, but I'm just going to call them SMRs or proposed reactors. And in my presentation, there are these cloud-like figures here. So there's more than 50 of these designs around the world. Most of them exist only on paper. Some people call them PowerPoint reactors. The most developed SMR design in the US is called NuScale. It's more than a PowerPoint reactor. Its designs have been engineered. It's pretty well ready to build. They've spent more than $1 billion on the design and engineering, and it's been 15 years in the pre-build stage, and it's not built yet. NB Power selected 2 of these designs for New Brunswick to be sited at Point Lepreau. So in 2018, that was the key year where really all of this started. The federal government launched what they call their SMR roadmap, which was their plan for rolling out these new nuclear reactors in different provinces. And in that year, New Brunswick Power chose designs by 2 small startup companies. Neither of them have ever built a nuclear reactor before. One was called Moltex Energy from the UK, and the other one called Arc Nuclear from the US. And then the government of New Brunswick and NB Power got together, formed a company that gave $5 million each to Moltex and Arc. And then Arc and Moltex set up offices in St. John. And then both companies, with the help of NB Power, applied for $70 million in federal funding. Okay. So then as far as funding goes, nothing much happened until last year. And then it became clear at some point that the federal government wasn't going to fund ARC in that particular round of funding. And so our provincial government stepped in and gave ARC $20 million. That was a year ago. And then the next year, the federal government gave Moltex about $50.5 million. There's no viable business case for new nuclear. I'll be talking about that later. And so there's a lack of private sector investors. And so the projects are dependent on public funds for further development. So what we have right now is intense promotion going on to secure public acceptance for more public sector payouts to these nuclear companies. Now, researchers who study this pre-project phase in general for big infrastructure projects, they call it the buzz phase. I like the term the happy talk phase. So here we go. So this is what's happening right now in New Brunswick. We're in this intense happy talk promotion of the new nuclear reactors. That is why you'll never find anything about nuclear waste or anything negative or anything about the risks of the new nuclear on either the NB Power website or the New Brunswick government website, because they only really want happy talk about these proposed new reactors. And both NB Power and the government, we've got the Natural Resources and Energy Development Department and the Department of Education are both involved in this, as well as NB Power, just promotional, basically. Okay, I know most of you are here because you're interested in climate action, and that's what I'm going to talk about first. You all know, I'm sure, that climate action means responding actively to the climate crisis we're in, and there's 2 dates that we have to focus on. We require rapid reduction of CO2 emissions by 2030, and we need to reach net zero emissions by 2050, ideally earlier. So this chart, I'm not going to go over it all. Just wanted to show you, to make the point. You'll see nuclear there, different kinds of nuclear. Fossil fuels are at the top. This is the life cycle CO2 emissions per kilowatt hour for electricity generators. And the only point I want to make here is that there's no such thing as a zero emission electricity generator. They all have a carbon footprint. But only nuclear emits radioactive gases and other waste. So the first question is, could the proposed SMRs help New Brunswick decarbonize by 2030? And the answer is no. If they had a license to operate in Canada, it could be possible to build one in less than 10 years, but there is none, neither of them have a license. The existing drawings don't meet the safety requirements. to contain the toxic radioactive elements. So every nuclear reactor, when it operates, and then the waste that comes out, they emit these very toxic, dangerous radioactive elements. And so the drawings have to be engineered to demonstrate that the machine can actually safely contain these dangerous elements. And the 2 reactors in New Brunswick are nowhere near that. They're just basically drawings on paper still. And just to point out that NuScale, the most developed SMR design in the US that I mentioned earlier, it's taken 15 years to go through that design and engineering phase, and it hasn't been built yet. I often hear, can we just use the reactors from nuclear submarines? No, for 2 reasons. First of all, the reactors in nuclear submarines are built for propulsion, not for generating the kind of electricity that we would need from them. But more importantly, the reactors in nuclear submarines use highly enriched military grade fuel. They're only used in military vessels. Nuclear submarines are military vessels. And with that fuel, which is highly enriched, it's much easier to make a nuclear weapon with the fuel. So it has to be heavily guarded, can only be used in military facilities. And if we were to put one at Point Lepreau, with the fuel that's required to operate it, we'd need to put a military base there, which we're not going to do. Do we need more nuclear to reach net zero by 2050, the other key date? And I would just say no, we don't. And it's not me, I'm not the expert on that. I would just like to point you to some people who are. Chris Rouse, if you Google Chris and his Nuclear Free Solutions website, you'll find some great information there. Dr. Louise Comeau from the Conservation Council of New Brunswick, there's a lot of info there. And then most recently, the Pembina Institute just last month put out a report. If you Google that, towards a clean Atlantic grid, you'll find out their models and calculations for how we could reach net zero without nuclear in New Brunswick. And then just to shout out the last line there to a new report that the Raven Project put out, the future of Point Lepreau option B, that gives you a few things to think about as well. But could they help? Could the proposed SMRs help New Brunswick reach net zero in 2050? Maybe we don't need them, but could they help if we had them? Yes, of course. If they existed before 2050 and if they worked reliably, yes, they could help. But the problem is there's no guarantee they will ever work to generate electricity reliably and economically. But really the question is, we need to focus on the lowest cost solution to the net zero target. I just want to do a little segue here. I was at a talk by Amory Lovins last week, and he brought up this very point, and I just took a screenshot of it. He talks about mind the logical gap. So here's the logical gap. People are hungry. Hunger is urgent. Caviar and rice are both food. Therefore, caviar and rice are both vital to reducing hunger. Well, no, that is ridiculous. When solving a problem needs both money and time, which are both finite resources, we must understand the relative cost and speed to choose effective solutions. So we have to look at what is the lowest cost and fastest solution to net zero. Well, really the cheapest and fastest solution is energy efficiency and conservation. But if we're going to build new electricity generators, it's not nuclear. The costs for nuclear are high and they're rising, and they're much lower costs for renewables, and those costs are going down fast. The figure here for new nuclear is for large nuclear. We don't have costs for small nuclear. However, the analysts are making the point that because of the economies of scale, it's actually less expensive to build big nuclear than small nuclear. So those costs for small nuclear are expected to be even higher. So this is the main reason why new nuclear lacks a business case and private sector investors. And if you look at where all the private sector money is going, it's going into renewables. It's not going into nuclear. So then the question is, well, why don't we just build everything? How about building both new nuclear and new renewables? Just throw everything at it. We're in a crisis. Well, the problem is that research analyzing 120 countries found that nuclear and renewables do not coexist well. They crowd each other out and limit effectiveness. And one of the major reasons for that is politics. The decision on which electricity generator to build is a political decision. And what's going on right now is a struggle for public money. And what I've done an analysis of the database, the lobby database in Ottawa, and as you would expect, I'm sure, the oil and gas lobby is hugely powerful. The nuclear lobby is also powerful, and both of them are more powerful than the renewables lobby, and they want all the funding for themselves. Both NB Power and Ontario Power Generation, which is the public utility in Ontario, have vice presidents on board of the Nuclear Industry Lobby Organization. So we have a VP Nuclear in NB Power. We don't have a VP Renewables, and that should tell you something. The latest integrated resource plan that NB Power put out, it basically forces nuclear energy with little room for renewables. And in Ontario, the new Premier Ford canceled renewable contracts, incurring more than $230 million in fees to focus on nuclear refurbishment and SMRs. Okay. So now I'm going to talk about the difference between SMRs and the existing Point Lepreau plant. This is a really important point because they're very, very different from the CANDU reactor, as it's called, that we have at Lepreau. Okay, first of all, I'm going to talk about how they're similar to Point Lepreau, the existing reactor. Well, first of all, they'll be costly to build. Lepreau, when it the first estimate in 1974 was 466 million. By the time it was built, it was 3 times that cost. The proposed SMRs, those 2 companies have been here for 4 years now, and you will never hear them talk about how much it's going to cost to build. They're very kind of quiet about that one. But in 2016, the CEO of one company is on record of saying that his first prototype would cost more than $2 billion. The other similarity of the new nuclear and existing is all nuclear reactors generate dangerous radioactive waste that we'll be paying to maintain forever. I'm going to talk more about that. And then all nuclear facilities could potentially support nuclear industry jobs in the Lepreau region. And of course, that's one reason why one of the reasons the government's so interested in this. However, the proposed SMRs, they're talking about automation. It's not clear how many jobs they will support if they're ever built. Okay, now I'm going to talk about how they're different from the existing reactor. Well, the big difference is that they have what the industry is calling advanced cooling systems, molten salt, liquid sodium versus water. Like Lepreau cools with water right now, but these are very different, and I'm going to talk a bit about that later. They also use different fuel. The new ones used enriched fuel, enriched uranium versus natural uranium that we have in Canada. The new ones are untested new versions of old advanced nuclear reactor designs that were never successfully commercialized. One of them actually ran for about close to 30 years in a laboratory setting, but it was never successfully commercialized. And the efforts to commercialize that particular reactor have ended in failure. And of course, they're smaller, meaning there's less power output than Lepreau, although they're actually still physically big. So we need more of them to produce the same amount of energy. NB Power is actually talking about putting up at least 4 of them they're talking about. It's not clear, but I've seen the CEO say at least 4. Okay, now I'm going to talk about radioactive waste and some safety and security concerns for the proposed designs. Well, All nuclear reactors create dangerous radioactive waste. It's a byproduct, and we've made lots of it already at Point Lepreau. It must remain safely contained for hundreds of thousands of years. And New Brunswickers we're responsible for the costs of keeping it safely contained for hundreds of thousands of years. And why that long? Well, it takes that long for the radioactive elements to decay to a level that does no harm. Because exposure to radioactive elements can cause serious chronic diseases, cancers, birth defects, and genetic damage that's passed on to future generations. So what you have here, what is this? This is a Google Maps screenshot. And this kind of forest green is the Point Lepreau, with the Point Lepreau nuclear generating station here, and it's surrounded by the Bay of Fundy. It goes into the Bay of Fundy. And then about a kilometer away, you have this facility here. This is an inset. This is high level, which is deadly radioactive waste. So there's 3 categories of radioactive waste: low level, intermediate, and high level, and which is by far the most dangerous. And that's what we have here. It's stored in these temporary concrete silos. There's a ground level view of them here. This is what it looks like. So what is it? So it's deadly. It's spent or irradiated fuel from the Lepreau reactors. So if you hear the term spent fuel, used fuel, irradiated fuel, it's all referring to the same thing. It's highly toxic and deadly. So when the fuel goes into the reactor, it goes in solid fuel rods with a kind of uranium pellets inside. And then it goes into the reactor and it's fissioned, meaning the atoms are split, and that's what creates the energy that basically creates the electricity. And as it's being fissioned, that reaction, that nuclear reaction, also creates a new element called plutonium that didn't exist before we had nuclear reactors. That's created inside the fuel canisters, basically. So then after 18 months, the fuel rods are spent, they're used, and then they're removed. But at that point, they become highly radioactive. So when they go in, you could actually, with just a little bit of shielding, you could handle them. But when they come out, because of all the fissioning, it's created all these radioactive particles, these products. And so it's extremely dangerous. If you actually stand near it without heavy shielding, you'll die pretty quickly. It's by far the most radioactive element that's out there. It contains many elements that haven't been fissioned yet, mainly this plutonium. And plutonium has 2 potential uses. It can potentially be used as fuel for nuclear reactors, and it can be used to make nuclear weapons, but we don't do either of those in Canada. So this spent fuel will need safe and secure storage forever, for hundreds of thousands of years. And there's no permanent storage facility anywhere on the planet, although both Sweden and Finland are building one. They don't have licenses yet. All countries that have nuclear power are storing their high-level waste in temporary facilities, even the countries that have already separated the plutonium. I'll be talking more about that later. It's all in temporary facilities because the permanent ones don't exist anywhere. NB Power is paying $5 million a year to be part of the organization that's looking for a site in Ontario, and they're planning to move the deadly Lepreau waste in future to a permanent storage facility on Indigenous territory in Ontario. The Chiefs of Ontario are opposed to that. And if you have any questions, I can tell you more about that during the Q&A. So what are the proposed SMRs planning? Well, there's 2, as I said. The Moltex stable salt reactor design includes a risky process involving Lepreau's high-level radioactive waste that I've just been talking about. And the ARC 100 reactor design includes importing radioactive materials into Canada. So here's the same screenshot that I showed you before with the Point Lepreau nuclear generating station here and the high-level waste, the used fuel right here. So this is just my own drawing. It's obviously not meant to look like the actual Moltex unit, but I just wanted to show you that the Moltex project includes 2 units. There's this one here is the Watts unit, the waste to stable salt, and this is the stable salt reactor here. So what Moltex is planning to do is to open up these used fuel silos and remove the solid rods of solid rods of waste move them over to the Watts unit, and basically melt the whole thing in molten salt. And then they're going to remove the plutonium from it, and they're going to make a new fuel, and they're going to fission it in the reactor. And then eventually there'll be new radioactive waste that results from that. So that's what they're going to do. The key thing I want you to keep in mind is they're turning solid fuel into solid radioactive waste into a liquid radioactive substance. Okay, so why am I calling it risky? Well, reprocessing, which is extracting plutonium from spent nuclear fuel, has never been done commercially in Canada. Our safety regulators have little to no capacity with it. Several countries have been reprocessing spent fuel for decades, and I can talk more about that if you want, why they're doing that. Most are trying to stop doing it because it's too costly and polluting. We actually have too much plutonium in the world. We have stockpiles of it, not in Canada, but in other countries. But Moltex wants it from Point Lepreau to fuel its reactor. Reprocessing raises nuclear weapons proliferation risks. Last year, 9 US scientists who were weapons non-proliferation experts, they wrote to our Prime Minister after the federal government funded the Moltex project, expressing serious concerns. And they've asked to have an independent international review of the Moltex project because of that. The proposal for New Brunswick is an experimental type of reprocessing called pyroprocessing. It extracts less than 1% of the fission products, mostly the plutonium, as I said. It's leaving 99% of a highly toxic liquid waste we've never had to deal with in Canada. And experts have raised many concerns about the process. It's not known yet how the corrosive new liquids can be contained. That will take extensive research and testing. So there's no scientific basis to claim that recycling, which you may have heard about, this is the phrase that the government and NB Power are using, they're going to recycle the fuel. There's no scientific claim basis to the claim that recycling, which is properly called reprocessing used fuel, is a solution to Lepreau's toxic radioactive waste problem. What it is doing is expanding a known problem into several unknown problems. And in addition, the reprocessed fuel costs considerably more than the natural uranium used at Lepreau right now. I have 2 slides just on the ARC 100 unit, which is the second unit. So this information here is from their prospectus, like what they put out to potential partners. This is the fuel sources for the second reactor, the ARC reactor. The first is enriched uranium. We don't have an enrichment plant in Canada, a uranium enrichment plant, so that would have to be imported. The waste created by what's called light water nuclear reactors, which we also don't have in Canada, so that would have to be imported. And then this last one is the nuclear material removed from nuclear weapons, which we also don't have in Canada, but it does raise the question because it can't operate on the uranium that we have here in Canada, that all of the fuel would have to be imported, presumably over the borders and across the roads of New Brunswick. And that just raises questions. Just something else about the ARC 100. I mentioned that it's called an advanced reactor because it has a different kind of coolant, and it's cooled not with water, but with liquid sodium metal. This is a material that bursts into flames on contact with air, and if it has contact with water, it actually explodes. There's been decades of research to commercialize this technology in many other countries, and they've all failed. And the cleanup of these sites was more expensive than the original nuclear build in all cases. Of course, there's the possibility of accidents. I mean, obviously, we would hope that something like that would never happen. And the companies proposing the nuclear reactors tell us that they're safe, but they've never built one. It's always a risk. We're still dealing with the meltdowns at Fukushima, Japan, that started more than 10 years ago. And last year, you might have heard that Japan approved a plan to release 1 million tons of radioactive water that they've been using to cool down the reactors that melted down, that they have more than 1 million tons last year of radioactive water that they want to release into the Pacific Ocean. And there's a lot of opposition to that, but it looks like that might happen. A major accident, obviously releasing dangerous radioactive materials, could damage the Bay of Fundy, which is one of the richest marine ecosystems on the planet. And then there's a question of, is the site climate resilient? Well, nuclear reactors, all radioactive waste and reactors that are on coasts are vulnerable to a changing climate. And just to point out that climate resiliency has never been adequately addressed in the NB Power license applications in the past, and it's not in this current one either. Of course, we have a safety regulator, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, that reviews the safety aspects of the proposed projects before issuing a license. They're not going to reject a license. They've never rejected a license application. What they're going to do is try and make it safe to the best of their ability. And I just want to point out that the CNSC did approve the temporary facility to store Lepreau's deadly radioactive waste near the Bay of Fundy before a long-term storage option exists. And of course, there's a concern that they'll also approve a temporary facility to store the proposed toxic liquid waste near the Bay of Fundy before we have permanent storage. And why there's this concern is that there's not going to be a federal impact assessment for these new reactors, because the project list for the new Federal Impact Assessment Act specifically excludes proposed SMRs sited next to an existing reactor, as Lepreau, for example, and that was the result of intense lobbying by the industry and unfortunately our safety regulator. So what that means is that the two proposed SMRs for New Brunswick are not required to have a federal impact assessment, and that means that we will have few opportunities to question the safety, health, and environmental aspects of the projects. I'm just going to speak really briefly about the financial risks of more nuclear. And by that, I mean higher power bills for us as customers and financial liability for NB taxpayers. I've just got 3 of them here. The first one is if NB Power decides to actually build the reactor. So, I mean, if it goes ahead with this, it has 2 options basically, right? It can build it or it can buy it from somewhere else and just operate it. If it actually builds it, there's the risk of building new nuclear, because since the Fukushima accident, the technical safety and security requirements have become increasingly complex and costly. There's uncertain. The construction cost hikes to enhance safety and security, and it's become very uncertain. And we have a history, as I've mentioned, of cost overruns for nuclear builds at NB Power. And just to point out, there's no uncertainty for renewables. NB Power knows what windmills cost, and they could put up a wind farm easily. And then there's the problem of NB Power's debt that I mentioned earlier. So basically, whether they build or operate an SMR, the problem is there's no wiggle room for errors. They're currently carrying a very high debt, 4.9 billion, and that's carried by all of us. As I mentioned, the debt is largely due to the cost. 3.6 billion of it is due to the cost overruns at Lepreau, which currently equals more than $4,500 of a nuclear debt for every adult and child in New Brunswick now. And, you know, we're talking about building more. And then, of course, the big financial risk of just operating it, because nuclear power is uncompetitive. The solar and wind are already the lowest cost. They're dropping rapidly. New nuclear can never reduce its price down to the price of renewables. And then, of course, there's the cost of managing the new liquid forms of nuclear waste. And we're going to be paying for the cost of the electricity generated. I'm just going to talk briefly about opposition to more nuclear reactors in New Brunswick, because there is, fortunately. So historically, and this is a picture from 2011 during the opposition to the Lepreau rebuild, or the refurbishment, the reactor rebuild. But originally, back in the late 70s, early 80s, the local communities around Lepreau were opposed to it, but they went ahead anyway. Environmental groups were also opposed to it. During the rebuild, the refurbishment, environmental groups were opposed to it. And in fact, after all the presentations to the New Brunswick Energy and Utilities Board, the NUB recommended against the Lepreau refurbishment. However, the government of the day overruled them, and Lepreau was refurbished with the result that we have now. So currently, social movement opposition to the new nuclear reactors, well, we have the Coalition for Responsible Energy Development in New Brunswick, CRED-NB, that consists of 10 core groups and more than 100 CRED champions listed on the website, and you can go to the website and see who everyone is. There's a modular nuclear reactor, or MNR caucus, of the New Brunswick Environmental Network that has 8 core groups, many of which are also involved in CRED. There's the National Stop SMRs Action Group with members that strategizes with members from New Brunswick, Quebec, Ontario, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan. And there's 120 public interest, civil society, Indigenous, and faith-based groups that have signed a public statement calling SMRs dirty, dangerous distractions from tackling climate change. It's on the website. I have the URL there, the Canadian Environmental Law Association. Political party positions. Provincially, there's only one party against the proposed SMRs. Federally, there's 3 opposition parties. The Bloc Québécois, the NDP, and the Green are opposed. This is from a climate rally outside the provincial legislature, that photo. The Assembly of First Nations is opposed. There's a resolution in 2018 demanding that the government abandon its plans to operate small modular nuclear reactors in Ontario and elsewhere, and to cease funding and support of the SMR program. The Williston Grand Council last year issued a resolution demanding for the Government of Canada and the Government of New Brunswick to immediately halt any further funding for nuclear reactors at Point Lepreau. This statement came out just after the New Brunswick government funded the ARC SMR last year, about a year ago. And then they've also asked for the Point Lepreau nuclear plant to be phased out and replaced with renewable energy and storage. Chief Hugh Akaji has a statement that he said that I can use in my presentation, so I'll read this. Chief Hugh Akaji from the Pesco-Tumakati Nation, whose traditional territory Point Lepreau is right on. And he says, though we have been here since time immemorial, the path into the future appears short, despite their guarantees of looking at hundreds of thousands of years of nuclear waste. The one guarantee, future impacts can only be devastating. Until the threat of nuclear waste has been removed, we can never believe nuclear can be the salvation of the planet, only imminent danger for mankind. I'm almost done here, last section. Now I'm going to focus on what's needed. Most of the photos were from the Bay of Fundy, and I have some more of them here. So first of all, what we all can do. Well, I would encourage you to read up and be informed about the plans for more nuclear for New Brunswick. 5 of us actually prepared a briefing paper for the Natural Resources and Energy Development Minister, Mike Holland. We met with him twice to try and convince him that his SMR plans were going down the wrong path, but it looks like he's not listening to us. Read the Indigenous statements about nuclear power and radioactive waste. I have a link there. They've been collected on a website that's managed by Dr. Gordon Edwards. Talk about what you learn with your friends and family, and write letters to the editor responding to a Happy Talk article that you see, and let your MLA and MP know what you think about more nuclear for New Brunswick. What we need NB Power to do is to make information public about the financial health and safety and nuclear weapons proliferation risks that their projects are going to expose us to, and what their mitigation plans are. Include a cost analysis for renewables versus nuclear power in its next integrated resource plan. We'd like to see NB Power develop a credible climate resiliency analysis for all its electricity generating stations. And my personal one, would you please stop promoting reprocessing, which is extracting plutonium from spent nuclear fuel, as a solution to Lepreau's used nuclear fuel problem, and stop calling it recycling, as less than 1% of the material is reused and the rest is a new dangerous liquid radioactive waste problem. What we need the New Brunswick to do, require plans to, well, ideally I'd like them to not fund them at all, but if they are, require plans to fund nuclear projects to be reviewed by independent scientists, which there's no evidence that that happened before our government funded the ARC project. Require nuclear companies operating in New Brunswick to demonstrate a feasible long-term solution for handling and storing the new toxic waste they will produce that will be New Brunswick's financial responsibility. Commission an independent feasibility study of the proposed SMR projects based on credible market data. They have one right now that's based on an imaginary market. And finally, develop a health impact assessment, including a protocol for monitoring the health status of people living, working, or playing near the proposed projects. This is my last slide. What we need the federal government to do. We need an independent international scientific review of the nuclear weapons proliferation implications of New Brunswick's plutonium plans. We want a debate in Parliament on plans for reprocessing in Canada. And we want a regular oversight of the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission by a parliamentary standing committee, which doesn't seem to be happening now. And an Auditor General report on the full costs of the liability for nuclear wastes, existing and proposed, including importing toxic waste from other countries. So I'd just like to say thank you to my colleagues who've taught me so much in New Brunswick. I think some of them are on the call across Canada and in the US and the UK. I just have a list here of people that I would recommend, scientists I would recommend that you consult for technical details. Ed Lyman from the Union of Concerned Scientists in Washington has a report called Advanced Isn't Always Better. If you Google that, there's a lot of really great information in that. So that's it. I'm happy to give you a copy of my slides and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Susan. That was really great. I always appreciate hearing these talks. Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Susan. That's a lot of work there, and we really appreciate it, everybody here. And yeah, we really appreciate your time.
Well, just to say thank you for your interest in this topic, everyone. I just really appreciate the fact that there's people who are really keen to learn more about it, and it energizes me. So thank you very much.